The Sworn Brotherhood of the Kingsguard, also known poetically as the White Swords or White Cloaks, are the royal bodyguards of the Iron Throne. Regarded as the finest knights in the Seven Kingdoms, they are sworn to protect their king and the royal family with their own lives, to obey his commands, and to keep his secrets. The Kingsguard was founded during the reign of the first Targaryen king on the Iron Throne, Aegon the Conqueror. The first Kingsguard was created at the suggestion of Aegon's sister wife, Queen Visenya Targaryen, after a Dornish assassination attempt on their lives in the streets of King's Landing in 10 AC. She deliberately modeled the Kingsguard vows of holding no lands or title on the ancient vows of the Night's Watch, and 7 knights were chosen because the king ruled the 7 kingdoms. The very first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was Corlys Valyrian, son of Daemon Valyrian and younger brother to Aemon Targaryen, and fittingly, he remains one of its most mysterious figures. We know little of Sir Corlys's battles, his campaigns, or the enemies he slew, but what we do know matters far more. He was personally chosen by Visenya Targaryen herself to command the first Kingsguard. In an age forged by conquest and dragonfire, Visenya did not choose lightly. Contemporary accounts remember Corlys as quick, strong, and keen-eyed, a master of sword and shield, and a knight utterly devoted to Aegon I Targaryen. He embodied what the Kingsguard was meant to be at its birth: loyalty without ambition, skill without vanity, service without question. His legacy endured quietly. Generations later, House Valyrian would name one of its greatest sons after him, Corlys Valyrian, the Sea Snake, a reminder that even in silence, the first white sword was not forgotten. But this era of quiet ideals would not last. Corlys Valyrian represents the Kingsguard at its most distant and unknowable. From this early period, we have almost nothing. No detailed battles, no personal accounts, no first-hand perspectives. The names survive, the deeds mostly don't. The White Book preserves titles and loyalty, but very little else. For the first decades of the Kingsguard's existence, its knights move through history like shadows. They serve, they fight, and then they disappear into footnotes. It isn't until much later, when court politics became vicious and chroniclers more talkative, that individual Kingsguard stepped fully into the record. The first of them is a knight whose life we can actually trace in detail, a man remembered not just for how well he fought, but for the damage he caused. Criston Cole is one of the most divisive Kingsguard in Westeros history. Some people remember him as a bitter political schemer. Others remember him as one of the deadliest warriors of his generation. So how good was Criston Cole at fighting? Criston was the son of Lord Dondarrion's steward, and likely common-born. Unlike most Kingsguard, he didn't rise through family power. He rose through skill. Criston first proves himself in 104 AC at the tourney of Maidenpool, celebrating the ascension of Viserys I Targaryen. Criston wins the melee, and during the fighting, he knocks Aemon Targaryen's Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister out of his hands with a morning star. That's notable. Daemon is already an experienced warrior, and Valyrian steel is no small advantage. In the joust, Criston unhorses Daemon again, and also defeats Arik and Eric Cargill, both future Kingsguard. Criston is eventually unhorsed himself, but by that point he'd clearly been established as an elite. Soon after, Criston is named personal sworn shield to Rhaenyra Targaryen, and in 105 AC, at just 23 years old, he's appointed to the Kingsguard, replacing the legendary Rhaem Redwyn. That's an unusually young age, and suggests Criston was considered one of the best fighters in the realm. Criston continues to dominate in tournaments. In 111 AC, wearing Rhaenyra's favor, he unhorses Sir Gwayne Hightower, the Queen's champion. Whatever else Criston becomes later, at this point he's clearly one of the most dangerous men on the field. His most brutal display of strength comes in 114 AC at Rhaenyra's wedding feast. During the melee, Criston shatters Harwin Strong's collarbone and elbow, earning Harwin the mocking name Broken Bones. He also caves in the helm of Sir Joffrey Lonmouth with his morning star. Joffrey dies days later from the wound. This wasn't a duel, it wasn't honorable, but it was effective. Criston's weapon of choice, the Morning Star, is particularly lethal against armored opponents, and Criston uses it with devastating force. Around this time, Criston becomes Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. He also trains Prince Aemon Targaryen, who grows into a highly dangerous warrior himself, suggesting Criston's skill wasn't just personal. He could teach it. During the Dance of the Dragons, Criston becomes known as the Kingmaker, and later serves as Hand of the King. From a combat perspective, what matters is that Criston leads armies in the field. He sacks towns, forces houses into submission, mission and plans the ambush at Rook's Rest that kills Princess Rhaenys and her dragon melees, though the fighting there is done mostly by dragons. Criston's end comes at the Butcher's Ball. He's exhausted, outnumbered, short on supplies, and surrounded. Criston offers to surrender if his men are spared. When that's refused, he challenges enemy commanders to single combat. Instead, he's shot dead by archers. Criston Cole does not die in a duel. He does not fall to a superior swordsman. He's killed by tactics and numbers. Taken together, Criston's record paints a very specific picture. In his prime, Criston was unquestionably elite. He defeated Aemon Targaryen, dominated melees, crippled Harwin Strong, killed Joffrey Lonmouth, rose from common birth to Lord Commander, and trained dangerous fighters of the next generation. But unlike the very greatest warriors, Criston doesn't have a long list of clean, high-level duels against legendary opponents. His career is defined more by brutality and consistency than by iconic single combats. Criston Cole was a top-tier Kingsguard, just not the very best. And after Criston, the Kingsguard retreats into obscurity until the reign of Viserys II, when the white cloak is worn by a man remembered not for politics or crown-making, but for honor and unmatched skill at arms. Aemon Targaryen, known as the Dragon Knight, is remembered as the perfect Kingsguard, noble, loyal, and almost impossibly skilled. For many characters in Westeros, Aemon represents what a knight should be. But how good was Aemon the Dragon Knight in actual combat? Aemon was born in 136 AC to Prince Viserys Targaryen and Lara Rogaire. From a young age, he proved exceptional with arms. As a young man, Aemon became so accomplished with sword and lance that he was entrusted with Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword once wielded by Visenya Targaryen and later by Daemon. Shortly after his sister Naerys married Aegon, Aegon joined the Kingsguard at just 17 years old during the reign of Aegon III Targaryen. Over the course of his life, Aegon would serve under 5 different kings, an unusually long and stable career for a Kingsguard knight. One notable measure of Aemon's skill comes from his own words. Aemon once fought Cragan Stark and later claimed he had never faced a finer swordsman. That's a remarkable statement, given Cragan's fearsome reputation. Aemon's most famous military service came during Daeron I Targaryen's invasion of Dorne. During the campaign, Aemon saved Daeron's life by throwing himself in front of a poisoned arrow meant for the king. Aemon survived the poison, recovered, and returned to the war. Back in Dorne, Aemon won great renown by defeating a Dornish champion in single combat. However, the conquest ultimately failed, and during peace negotiations in 161 AC, Daeron was betrayed and killed. Aemon and 4 other Kingsguard fought to defend him. 3 Kingsguard died, 1 surrendered, and Aemon was captured only after killing 2 of the attackers. Aemon's captivity at will became legendary. He was imprisoned naked in a crow cage suspended over a pit of vipers. When Baelor I Targaryen came south to make peace, he personally entered the pit to rescue Aemon. Aemon then carried the poisoned Baelor across half the continent to safety. This episode contributes heavily to Aemon's myth, though it says more about endurance and devotion than swordsmanship. Under Aegon IV Targaryen, Aemon served as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. During this reign, Aemon fought one of his most famous duels, a trial by combat against Sir Morgil Hastwyck, who had accused Queen Naerys of adultery. Aemon slew Morgil, defending his sister's honor. Aemon also proved his skill in tournaments. Disguised as the Knight of Tears, he won a tourney his brother had forbidden him to enter, defeating all challengers and crowning Naerys Queen of Love and Beauty. This again reinforces Aemon's image as both supremely skilled and quietly defiant. Despite Aegon IV's resentment toward him, Aemon remained loyal to his king. That loyalty ultimately cost him his life. Aemon died defending Aegon IV from assassins of House Toyne, killing one and mortally wounding the other before being slain himself. Aemon's reputation is unusually consistent, but it's still built more on respect than raw body count. Aemon had exceptional technical skill. He wielded Valyrian steel, defeated champions, fought elite warriors, survived campaigns, and earned the respect of men like Cragan Stark. His reputation was not built on a single feat, but on decades of consistent excellence. Aemon the Dragon Knight was not the most brutal Kingsguard. He was not the most aggressive, but he may have been the most complete, combining elite skill, discipline, and absolute loyalty. And after Aemon, the Kingsguard enters a new phase. The next generation would produce fewer perfect knights, and more men defined by rivalry, bloodshed, and personal personal vendetta. Among them was a warrior whose name became inseparable from a single legendary duel. Gwayne Corbray is remembered almost entirely for one fight, but what a fight it was. Gwayne fought during the First Blackfire Rebellion at the Battle of the Red Grass Field in 196 AC. He served in the vanguard of Lord Donal Arryn's army, and when the Arryn lines were shattered by the charge of Daemon Blackfire, the situation was close to collapse. That's when Gwayne Corbray arrived with reinforcements. Gwayne encountered Daemon on the battlefield, and the two fought a horse for nearly an hour. This wasn't a quick clash. It was a prolonged, evenly matched duel between two elite warriors, each wielding Valyrian steel. Gwayne with Lady Forlorn and Daemon with Blackfire. According to the accounts, the duel was extraordinary to witness. Two champions, two Valyrian blades, neither giving ground. That alone tells us something important. Gwayne Corbray was able to stand toe-to-toe with Daemon Blackfire, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest warriors of his age. Eventually, Daemon gained the upper hand. He cut through Gwayne's helm, blinding him and leaving him bleeding and helpless. But instead of finishing him, Daemon dismounted and ordered that Gwayne be carried to the rear for treatment. This act of chivalry turned out to be a fatal mistake. While Daemon paused, Brynden Rivers used the opportunity to position his raven's teeth on a ridge. A storm of arrows followed, killing Daemon and his twin sons, Aegon and Aemon Blackfire, and ending the rebellion. With Gwayne, everything hinges on a single moment. Gwayne loses his only famous duel. He is blinded, defeated, and removed from the battlefield. But context matters. He fought Daemon Blackfire, arguably the deadliest knight of the era, for nearly an hour and survived. Very few warriors in Westerosi history can claim that. Gwayne Corbray's reputation rests on quality rather than quantity. We don't have a long list of victories, but the one fight we do have places him firmly among the elite. He wasn't the greatest warrior of his generation, but he was good enough to push the greatest to his limits, and sometimes that's enough to be remembered forever. But the First Blackfire Rebellion produced another knight whose reputation didn't rest on a single duel, but on a lifetime of trials, battles, and hard-earned honor. A knight who began as a nameless hedge knight and ended as the standard by which all others were measured. That knight was Duncan the Tall. Duncan the Tall is one of the strangest cases on any list of great knights because he starts with absolutely nothing. Duncan grew up in Flea Bottom, a street orphan who never knew his parents, surviving through theft, brawling, and brute strength. His early fighting experience didn't come from tourneys or training yards. It came from fighting other street kids for food. And by his own admission, he was the worst of them. Duncan's life changes when he's taken on as a squire by Sir Arlen of Pennytree, a hedge knight. Arlen teaches Duncan how to fight properly, and together they wander Westeros for years. Duncan learns endurance, discipline, and how to survive real danger, not just ceremonial combat. From early on, Duncan dreams of joining the Kingsguard, though he's painfully aware of how far above his station that is. Duncan first enters history at the tourney of Ashford Meadow in 209 AC. After Sir Arlen dies on the road, Duncan competes under the name Sir Duncan the Tall, a name chosen mostly because it sounds impressive and happens to be true. Duncan is nearly 7 feet tall. At Ashford, Duncan proves that he's not just big, but dangerous. He defends a puppeteer from Prince Aemon Targaryen, attacking the prince outright. This leads to a trial of 7, where Duncan fights alongside 6 allies against Aemon's champions, including 3 Kingsguard. Duncan survives the trial and personally defeats Aemon in single combat using strength, grit, and the brutal fighting instincts he learned in Flea Bottom. This is not elegant swordplay. It's raw, close-quarters violence. Duncan wins because he's stronger, tougher, and refuses to break. Over the next years, Duncan continues as a hedge knight, fighting real battles rather than tourneys. In Dorne, he survives desert travel, sea combat, and skirmishes. Later, while serving Sir Eustace Osgrey, Duncan fights Sir Lucas Inchfield in a trial by combat. Duncan wins again, relying heavily on wrestling and sheer physical dominance, even while taking serious wounds. At White Walls, Duncan kills Sir Tommen Heddle in combat and helps expose a Blackfire conspiracy that ends the Second Blackfire Rebellion before it begins. Duncan isn't the most skilled jouster at White Walls. He's eliminated early, but in real fighting, he remains deadly. Duncan's career reaches its peak under Aegon V Targaryen, formerly Duncan's squire, Egg. Duncan eventually joins the Kingsguard, fulfilling the dream he'd held since childhood. He later becomes Lord Commander. As a Kingsguard knight, Duncan proves himself in war. During the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion, he personally personally slays Daemon III Blackfyre. He also serves as Aegon V's champion against Lord Lionel Baratheon, defeating him in trial by combat and ending the rebellion. Even late in life, Duncan remains formidable. In a winter tourney in 252 or 253 AC, Duncan, now aging, is defeated by a 16-year-old Barristan Selme. This loss isn't an embarrassment, it's a passing of the torch. Duncan dies at Summerhall in 259 AC alongside King Aegon V. Though the details are unclear, accounts suggest that Duncan's actions saved lives during the catastrophe. Duncan the Tall is not remembered for flawless technique or legendary duels with Valyrian steel. He's remembered because he endured. He fought in streets, trials, rebellions, and wars. He beat princes, knights, and pretenders. And he did it without noble birth, magical weapons, or mythic status. Duncan represents a different kind of greatness. Not perfection, persistence. Not elegance, resolve. But the Kingsguard would still produce knights whose skill at arms was so refined, so overwhelming that they became living standards of excellence rather than stories of struggle. And among them stood a man remembered not for rising from nothing, but for being almost impossibly formidable from start to finish. That man was Gerold Hightower, the White Bull. Gerold Hightower, known as the White Bull, is remembered less for individual duels and more for what he represented. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't romanticized. He was simply overwhelming. Even in old age, Gerold was considered fierce. Jaime Lannister later reflects that in his prime, Gerold would have been stronger than Jaime ever was. His entry in the White Book is described as big and forceful, which is fitting. Everything about Gerold suggests authority. Gerold became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in 259 AC following the death of Duncan the Tall. This alone tells us something important. Duncan was a living legend, and Gerold was trusted to replace him. During the War of the Nine Penny Kings, Gerold took command of the royal forces after the death of the Hand of the King, Lord Ormond Baratheon. This wasn't ceremonial leadership, it was battlefield command. After the war, Gerold accepted Barristan Selme into the Kingsguard, bringing in a man who would later be regarded as the greatest knight alive. Gerold was not invulnerable. Around 280 AC, he was shot through the hand by Ulmer of the Kingswood Brotherhood. But even this episode reinforces Gerold's reputation. He survives, continues serving, and remains active despite the wound. At the tourney of Harrenhal in 281 AC, Gerold fastens the white cloak onto the shoulders of Jaime Lannister, personally inducting the youngest Kingsguard in history. When King Aerys II Targaryen orders Jaime back to King's Landing, Gerold offers to go in his place so the boy can compete. Aerys refuses. Gerold is also present for the darkest moments of Aerys' reign. When Rickard Stark is burned alive and Brandon Stark dies strangling himself, Gerold reminds Jaime of a hard truth. The Kingsguard are sworn to protect the king, not to judge him. This isn't weakness, it's discipline taken to its extreme. During Robert's rebellion, Gerold is sent to find Prince Rhaegar after the Battle of the Bells. Rhaegar eventually returns to King's Landing. Gerold does not. Instead, he appears at the Tower of Joy in Dorne, alongside Arthur Dayne and Oswell Went, guarding Lyanna Stark. When Eddard Stark arrives with 6 companions, Gerold is given multiple chances to leave. He refuses every one of them. Gerold dies fighting at the Tower of Joy. There are no tricks, no retreats, no clever escapes. When it's over, stones from the tower are used to build his cairn on a nearby ridge. Gerold Hightower doesn't leave behind a catalogue of famous duels. What he leaves behind is something rarer: absolute consistency. For decades, he was the physical and moral backbone of the Kingsguard, stronger than most, relentless to the end. But even Gerold stood beside a man whose reputation eclipsed his own. A knight whose skill with the sword was spoken of with awe, whose name became synonymous with death itself, and whose legend survived even those who killed him. That knight was Arthur Dayne. Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, is the benchmark. Whenever characters in A Song of Ice and Fire talk about the greatest knights who ever lived, Arthur Dayne's name is the one they measure everyone else against. He isn't remembered for politics, command, or longevity. He's remembered for being deadly. Arthur was a knight of House Dayne and a member of Aerys II Targaryen's Kingsguard. He was also Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's closest friend. His reputation among his peers is almost universally unmatched. Jaime Lannister, who idolized Arthur, believes Arthur was stronger than him. Catelyn Stark calls Arthur the deadliest of Aerys' Kingsguard. John Connington remembers Arthur as an efficient battlefield commander. And then there's the author. George R.R. Martin has said that Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selme are evenly evenly matched when fighting with ordinary swords. But if Arthur wields Dawn, the ancestral greatsword of House Dayne, Martin says Arthur would win. That distinction matters because Dawn is not Valyrian steel. It's something older, lighter, and uniquely lethal, and Arthur wielded it as Sword of the Morning. Arthur's most clearly documented combat feat is his defeat of the Smiling Knight, leader of the Kingswood Brotherhood. Arthur first won the trust of the small folk by paying for supplies and addressing their grievances, then hunted the outlaws down. In the end, Arthur slew the Smiling Knight in single combat, a man described as the terror of his age. After the fight, Arthur knighted Jaime Lannister. Arthur also proved himself repeatedly in tournaments. He defeated Rhaegar in the tourney held to celebrate the birth of Prince Viserys. In later tourneys, the two traded victories, Arthur breaking 12 lances against Rhaegar in one contest and losing to him in others, including Harrenhal. These weren't one-sided contests. They were clashes between equals. During the events leading into Robert's Rebellion, Arthur disappears from public life alongside Oswell Went and Gerold Hightower. After the rebellion's end, the three are found at the Tower of Joy in Dorne. What happens there is famously unclear. The official history claims that Eddard Stark killed Arthur in single combat, but Ned himself later says that Arthur was the finest knight he ever saw, and that Arthur would have killed him if not for Howland Reed's intervention. Arthur Dayne dies at the Tower of Joy, but not before killing several of Ned's companions. Like Gerold Hightower, stones from the tower are used to build his cairn. So Arthur Dayne's legend rests on a strange foundation. We don't see him cut down armies. We don't see him win wars. Instead, we see universal respect from friends, enemies, and even the man who killed him. Arthur Dayne may not have the longest list of recorded victories, but when the characters and the author himself agree on someone's greatness, that carries weight. Arthur Dayne is remembered not because of what he accomplished, but because no one ever doubted that, in a fair fight, he was the man to beat. Barristan Selme, known as Barristan the Bold, is the rare case where the legend actually holds up under scrutiny. Barristan is often described as the greatest living knight of his age, and unlike many others on this list, we see him fight across an entire lifetime. In his youth, in his prime, and even in his old age, Barristan first makes a name for himself absurdly early. At 16, he unhorses Prince Duncan Targaryen and Duncan the Tall and is knighted on the spot by Aegon V Targaryen. That alone would be enough to mark him as exceptional. Barristan proves it wasn't a fluke during the War of the Nine Penny Kings. He cuts his way through the Golden Company and kills Maelys Blackfyre in single combat, ending the male Blackfyre line entirely. This is one of the clearest, cleanest examples of elite battlefield performance in the series. At 23, Barristan joins the Kingsguard, giving up lands, inheritance, and marriage. From that point on, he serves under multiple kings, good and bad, without ever losing his reputation. His most famous feat comes during the Defiance of Duskendale. With King Aerys II Targaryen held hostage, Barristan infiltrates the town alone, disguised as a beggar. He climbs the walls, kills guards silently, frees the king, fights his way out through the streets, and escapes on horseback, all while taking an arrow to the chest. This isn't tournament skill. This is real, lethal combat under pressure. Barristan continues to prove himself against outlaws as well, killing Simon Toyne in single combat and helping dismantle the Kingswood Brotherhood. In tournaments, he defeats Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, showing that his skill extends beyond the battlefield. During Robert's Rebellion, Barristan fights at the Trident, killing a dozen enemy knights while suffering wounds from arrow, spear, and sword. He survives, and is spared by Robert Baratheon, who later names him Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Even in middle age, Barristan remains formidable. He leads assaults during the Greyjoy Rebellion. At 57, he wins a tourney. In his 60s, he unhorses Sandor Clegane. When Barristan is dismissed by Joffrey Baratheon, he escapes King's Landing unarmed, killing 2 gold cloaks despite his age. Later, in Essos, he kills the Titan's bastard with a stick, slays the pit fighter Kraz, and personally leads infiltration assaults during the conquest of Meereen. What makes Barristan unique isn't just peak ability, it's durability. He wins fights across 6 decades. He adapts. He survives. And when his ideals fail him, his sword still doesn't. According to George R.R. Martin, Barristan and Arthur Dayne are equals when fighting with ordinary swords. The difference is that Barristan leaves behind proof. We see his victories. Barristan Selme isn't the most mythologized knight in Westeros. He doesn't rely on legend. He's simply the one who kept winning. Jaime Lannister is one of the most naturally gifted fighters in Westerosi history, and also one of the most frustrating. From a very young age, Jaime shows extraordinary talent with a sword. He wins a tournament melee at just 13 years old, fighting grown men and beating them outright. By 15, he's fighting the Kingswood Brotherhood, where he holds his own against the Smiling Knight, a man so dangerous that even seasoned knights feared him. Jaime is knighted by Arthur Dayne himself, and soon after becomes the youngest Kingsguard in history. That alone puts him in rare company. Kingsguard aren't chosen for potential, they're chosen because they're already elite. In his prime, Jaime believes he is faster and stronger than knights like Loras Tyrell, and Barristan Selme later reflects that Jaime was one of the best natural swordsmen he had ever seen. George R.R. Martin consistently includes Jaime in discussions of the greatest fighters in the series. Jaime's battlefield record supports this reputation. During the War of the Five Kings, he leads cavalry charges personally, cutting through enemy soldiers with ease. At the Whispering Wood, Jaime fights his way deep into the northern host, killing multiple men and nearly reaching Robb Stark himself, stopping only because his sword becomes lodged in a man's neck. That moment is important. Jaime isn't stopped by a better fighter. He's stopped by bad luck. Jaime also proves his skill outside of battle. Even months after imprisonment, malnourishment, and with his hands chained together, Jaime fights Brienne of Tarth in a long, brutal duel. Brienne eventually wins, but she later reflects that a healthy, unchained Jaime would almost certainly have defeated her. Before losing his hand, Jaime is confident he could defeat the Mountain and the Hound. That confidence isn't just arrogance. It's based on speed, precision, and technique. Jaime doesn't rely on size or brutality. He relies on timing and control, and then he loses his sword hand. After that, Jaime is no longer one of the greatest fighters in Westeros. His skill declines sharply, and while he continues to train and adapt, he never regains what he lost. The Kingslayer becomes a commander, a diplomat, and a strategist, not a champion. Jaime Lannister's reputation is therefore split in two. In his prime, Jaime may have been the most naturally talented swordsman of his generation, faster than most, sharper than almost everyone, and trained by the best knights alive. But unlike Barristan Selme or Duncan the Tall, Jaime's greatness is brief. His peak is cut short before it can fully mature. We never see him fight Arthur Dayne or Barristan Selme in their primes. His legend is one of potential, not longevity. Jaime Lannister wasn't the greatest Kingsguard who ever lived, but for a few short years, he might have been the most dangerous man in Westeros with a sword in his hand. Ranking the greatest Kingsguard is a little bit unfair. These men didn't all fight the same wars. They didn't face the same enemies. Some lived long enough to build legends, others burned brightly and vanished. Some are remembered because we saw them fight, others because everyone who survived them agree they were terrifying. Duncan the Tall shows us what perseverance looks like. Gerold Hightower shows us discipline taken to its extreme. Arthur Dayne shows us how myth is born. Barristan Selme shows us what happens when greatness lasts. And Jaime Lannister shows us how fragile even the most natural talent can be. None of them represent the Kingsguard perfectly, but together they do. And that's the real story of the White Cloaks. Not a line of flawless heroes, but a long experiment in honor, loyalty, and violence. One that succeeds just often enough to be remembered, and fails just often enough to be tragic. George R.R. Martin has said that asking who would win in a fight is the wrong question. Circumstances matter, luck matters, the day matters. He's probably right, but that won't stop us from arguing about it anyway.